MSD podcast, Head and Neck Medical Implications of Mil Close Combat Part 1. Having an understanding of the medical implications of assaults, armed and unarmed, is important both for risk reduction and for achieving objectives in threat neutralization in military close combat. I have instructed medical implications on military and civilian courses for several decades, both from a self-protection, risk prevention or risk reduction perspective, and also from an actions-on threat neutralization employment perspective. While in CQB, CQC and MSD, you do not have to be a medical expert as far as having to have a full knowledge of the intricacies and complexities of bodily workings and detailed human anatomy and how everything connects and functions. However, you do need to know how to incapacitate, or for the kill or die mil battlefield, how to eliminate, and this requires knowledge of target location and of what the probable outcomes of effective targeting will be. While our mil close combat tradecraft is primarily about human anatomy destruction, and you do not need to be a medical expert to neutralize an enemy by gross overkill skills means, having combined threat neutralization knowledge and expertise as well as self-protective hard protection capabilities to protect soft sensitive human sensors and life support systems is of primary importance. You do also need to understand risks and dangers of wounds and injuries to be able to hard protect against them being targeted or contacted, preventing or reducing wounds and injuries to the lowest level humanly possible. For this podcast, the focus will be on the head and neck mil CQC primary targets that are also the combatant's most self-protection necessary, soft, sensitive, and life support systems essential to close quarters actions on threat neutralization, objective achievement. I'm not going to focus on human anatomy parts and functions that are not mil self-defense and mil close combat tradecraft primary practice related. Less is more, and when by targeting of delicate human sensors or soft targets, including life support systems, you can effect an immediate release of a hold or grip on you, as well as have the capacity to incapacitate or neutralize an enemy, there is no need for focusing on low-level release techniques like pressure points that may not have an immediate reactionary effect on a formidable enemy. Lesser means may well escalate risk and danger by inciting high levels of hostilities. This podcast file will provide general, probable contact or penetration subject matter information in regard to human anatomy targeting wounds and injuries, because in violent overkill actions on by means of gross motor skills or deliberate soft targets, hard destructive employments, the contact or penetration, although localized, may not be pinpoint accurate but will lead to threat neutralization and or collateral damage. Often the objective of the mil battlefield may be an immediate takeout, but if not immediately achieved, the enemy will be injured or wounded, as in disarmed and disabled and unable to recover, and by continued hostilities will be disposed of simply by the nature and level of destruction. The medically correct full bodily functions and related and connected workings and terminology is beyond what is required in mil close combat and self-defense, risk reduction under assault, and for primary targeting threat neutralization by hard, heavy, and hostile means. Understanding the risks of contact, impact, and wounding on human anatomy specific targets and regions, and how to protect such targets and regions under assault by hard cover guarding protection, as well as kill zone evasion or escape clearing actions, threat neutralization is important in self-protection and self-preservation. Likewise, such knowledge and know-how is important in enemy threat neutralization, human anatomy targeting. We consider ourselves in mil close combat more specialists in destruction than repair, but also understand the major importance of hard targeting protection against enemy targeting of our human anatomy life support systems. The destruction threat neutralization skills we instruct for the battlefield and kill or die objective achievement must include high-level combatant hard targeting, self-protection, and self-preservation capabilities. The focus in this podcast file will be on soft and sensitive human anatomy targets and life support systems that can cause incapacitation or lethal outcomes, threat neutralization, that could be targeted in close combat actions on, and that the combatant needs to hard target protect against such targeting. I am not going to go into the required destruction forces for human bones, ligaments, or complex human anatomy functions, as this is about mil-close combat, which is a military science and tradecraft and not an exact science, and as such does not need to focus on lesser considerations at an exponent or general enthusiast level. Battle-proven primary targets are predominantly soft, sensitive targets that, by hard, point-blank range destruction, deep penetration, and overkill, hard spinal and extremities destructive output contact, are as close as guaranteed as it gets in enemy neutralization. The reality is, MIL-CQC is an overkill capability tradecraft science, not an exact science, and 3/4 of full physical output momentum derived impact, contact, or penetration would be more than enough to stop a formidable enemy foe in their tracks. Soft, sensitive targets such as human sensors and life support systems are what the combatant must know about from a hard targeting, safety risk reduction perspective and from a threat neutralization perspective. Such targeting in our MSD and mil-close combat are fit for role, duty, and actions on purpose over targets and targeting that are not primary proven incapacitation or lethal elimination outcomes likely, and are more bumps, bruises, cuts, superficial pain, and non-lethal related. The type of skills for the battlefield and kill or die actions on would never be allowed in sport, and boots, body armor, and weapons make big differences in fast and furious or covert, quick and quiet, formidable foes threat neutralization. Stunning as part of seizing and securing setups, including grasping, controlling, and containing in order to employ incapacitation or enemy elimination skills, are part of mil-close combat and MSD for the battlefield and include grabbing the scruff of the neck, throat, and hair, as well as battle dress, webbing, and body armor. This is what is referred to in mil-close combat as the 3Ds, disarm, disable, dispose, or I should say, part of the 3Ds, when immediate, covert, or compromised threat neutralization cannot be achieved. The reality is, if a foe is introducing a combatant to superficial pain and discomfort, and the combatant's modus operandi is to respond by battle-proven incapacitation or elimination, threat neutralization means they will quickly get the upper hand by targeting soft, sensitive human sensors or life support systems by overkill, mil-close combat or MSD, battle-proven incapacitation or elimination threat neutralization methods. Knowledge of the probable medical outcomes of an enemy targeting of your sensitive, delicate, soft targets, including life support systems, is not only vital for threat neutralization, but also for combatant hard targeting and risk reduction, safety, immediately combined with effective threat neutralization. Starting from the top of the head down to the sternal notch in the front of the body and the 7th cervical vertebrae in the rear of the body, this podcast file will cover risks, dangers, and probable outcomes of head and neck injuries relating to military close combat and MSD actions on by unarmed means, as well as armed non-ballistic weapons means. It will also outline some common terrain and environmental risks and dangers in an urban actions on that could, through impact, cause incapacitation or fatal injuries. Starting with the hair, the seizure and securing of the hair can be both pain-inducing and restrictive and provide a seized and secured static foe for ongoing hostilities. A good friend of mine and top wrestler had a saying that is very true, in that pain is your friend and pressure is your enemy. Pain is part of living, and under threat, stopping pain by stopping the enemy in their tracks is what is required. Pressure equates to something is under high risk of threat, of being crushed, dislocated, broken or fractured, and self-preservation and preventative self-protection combined with hard, heavy and hostile, armed or unarmed threat neutralization is required. So while seizing of the hair is not life-threatening on its own, it certainly can be part of seized and secured targeting of sensitive, soft human anatomy targets, including the spinal cord. The hair around the temple area can cause increased pain if seized, secured, and by rotational twisting, manipulation, and pulling, it can be used to decentralize or directionally manipulate. This hair seizing and securing has been known to be used to facilitate headbutting or kneeing to the chin or face in street fights. The late Captain Ben Mangles would employ his South African steering wheel takedown from a double hair seizure and head manipulation, which, when I assisted Ben delivering training, I had demonstrated on me many times over. Hair seizure and manipulation, like battlefield takedowns, can be employed to utilize terrain and hazards to cause injury or even death. Seizing and securing the enemy and ramming their soft targets and life support bodily parts into hard surfaces and protrusions, like with takedowns, to neutralize an enemy by hard impact with trees, rocks, are the outcomes of enemy seizing, securing, manipulation, movements and decentralization, causing hard, sharp impact with terrain and environment hazards. The reality is employing low-level grabbing or holding of a mentally tough combatant that does not stun, incapacitate, eliminate, or completely control and contain a formidable foe can easily be stopped by direct, hard actions on targeting of a combatant's soft targets. Clinching can be easily neutralized by unarmed or armed, foul or deadly methods, and a bit of pain can be stopped by combined pain relief tactics combined with hard targeting self-protection and the hard targeting of enemy soft targets. This podcast is coming to you from someone with a long-term involvement with combat sports, but on the battlefield, if a combatant is clinching, grappling or wrestling with an armed enemy or an unarmed enemy combatant that is trying to kill them by foul or deadly means, it is suicidal. Then there is the consideration of the enemy's comrades that are also trying to kill the static, tied-up combatant. Sport is sport, and traditional arts practices are what they are, and kill or die, mill battlefield actions on provide very different risks, dangers, and probable outcomes by foul or deadly means that make even the most formidable vulnerable. It is important to understand that our mill close combat tradecraft practices used to put a stop to grabbing, clinching, grappling, and wrestling is by targeting soft targets with destructive, continuous targeting, high-level velocity to cause a release and incapacitate or eliminate, not only by unarmed means, but also by primary or backup weapons means. Even by the combatant's boots, helmet, battle dress, and body armor, they have hard protection and as such are armed with threat neutralization capabilities. It can come down to the individual's mental toughness and inner resolve in resisting the effects of a bit of pain, knowing they can put a stop to hostilities in an instant. For those that have low-level tolerances to such pain, the reality may well come down to their mind following the pain, which can bring on helplessness and hopelessness or blind panic. The seizure and securing of the hair on top of the back of the head with a rear flank grip can be an indicator of neck, chin, eyes, throat, or nostrils targeting, or setups for various reasons, including decentralization or incapacitation, injury, or by lethal skills, elimination. There are a range of our European mill elite unarmed offensive assault CQC skills that involve hair seizure, pulling, twisting to expose and provide secured access to soft human anatomy targets, combined with manipulation to achieve primary setup positions for threat neutralization skills employments from standing, grounded, seated, and in kneeling positions. Effective self-protection and self-preservation hardcover guarding includes using the enemy as cover against their own actions on attempts. in both unarmed offensive and counter-offensive assault actions on at close to point-blank body contact ranges. Combatants are instructed in what not to do, including never blindly reaching back behind themselves or turning their back on the enemy, exposing their rear flank, life support nape of their neck, like with turning your back on an enemy to over shoulder or hip throw. They are instructed in immediate, deliberate combat actions made possible by the enemy being initially seized and secured by the hair, head, battle dress, body armor, webbing, or by the seizure and securing of their arms as part of a setup and employment of threat neutralization. They know how to seize and secure an armed enemy as part of 3D's disarming, and how to, if wounding or injury is unpreventable, reduce risk to maintain threat neutralization capabilities by enemy neutralization, including escape and evasion. And unarmed counter-offensive assault actions on prior to threat neutralization skills employments, resistance, yielding, and or enemy manipulation, prior to or after hard seizure and securing, always under hard cover guard protected tactics, enabling high-level capabilities of targeting assaulters, soft targets with increased safety, and by most proven effective means is the order of actions on. Hair seizure can include risks of the head being slammed into hard surfaces or protrusions, and quick, hard threat neutralization is a must to stop this before the enemy's terminal objectives unfold. Identifying and understanding enemy intentions by their set-up actions, as well as being aware of environmental risks and dangers, can provide both threat prevention and threat counter-engagement. The next vulnerable human anatomy target, working down from the hair on the top of the head, is the bregma, also known as the anterior fontanelle, or another term in MIL CQC is the top knot. The anterior fontanelle in babies is the soft part on top of the head, still forming by closing to become the bregma by the process of the frontal and parietal bones meeting as the skull develops. The bregma is a skull suture's junction joining point, and as such, a hatchet-type impact could cause fractures or even sutures separation and injuries to both the frontal and parietal lobes of the brain. Injury to these lobes of the brain can be very serious, affecting wide-ranging, very important brain functions, and hard impact can cause a coma or be fatal. Battlefield hatchets and trench warfare weapons or battle helmets, hard downward contact actions to the skull can cause fatal injuries. There are 4 main skull sutures connecting the different major bone parts of the skull. Then there are other sutures that connect other cranial bones. While sutures can be considered weak points of the skull, they also can be considered as tough, solid joints that are dense, being made of fibrous connective tissue, and can increase the skull's capability to withstand impact contact forces by being capable of absorbing higher impact than bone. Sutures, being fibrous joints, allow for some flexibility, and as such can provide brain protection benefits through enabling movement and give in the skull that under contact impact can spread the level of contact impact force over it being centralized to the impact point. While there may well be increased vulnerability in a developing skull to contact impact, but in a fully developed skull, sutures can provide increased resistance through flexibility, increasing the capability to absorb contact impact. Always remember, overkill, deliberate actions on contact skills where the combatant and the enemy are trying to kill each other are all about get in first, maximum destruction, kill or die, targeting output, and as such are somewhat different to accidental impact or fisticuffs by intention. That's not saying that people haven't died from fisticuffs or being sucker punched, including neck or head contact with hard surfaces or protrusions in street fights as a result of falling, and the back of the head and neck contact with the road's curb, for instance. In criminal violence and street fighting, there are no rules and laws abided by, and when you combine this with hard surfaces and protrusions, environmental hazards and risks factors, along with the intention to cause injury or wound, the risks and dangers can be very real and even life-threatening. One of the more susceptible parts of the skull to fracture is the Terrian suture that is on the side of the skull in the temple area behind the eye between the forehead and the ear. This is where 4 of the skull bones meet and is considered the weakest point of the skull and as such more prone to fracture. The temple bone is often wrongly described as a very vulnerable part of the skull when it is in fact quite thick and not a primary mill close combat target. The sphenoid bone is a small piece of bone about the size of an average sized coin but shaped like a moth or a bat, positioned on the side of the head approximately 2.5 centimeters back from the eye. It is thinner bone than the temporal bone and is the only bone in the brain canister that is concave, that could, with high force targeting with weapons such as trench warfare weapons, result in a depressed fracture. The sphenoid bone, being part of the cranial base, is important in the cranial cavity protection of the brain and the brain stem. It also contains important openings and passages for nerves and arteries, including the optic nerve and internal carotid artery, providing protection as they enter or exit the brain. I have heard some fighting arts practitioners confuse the temple with the sphenoid bone. The temple artery runs over the sphenoid bone, and if slashed, this is a major wounding if the bleeding is not stopped quickly. The back of the head and neck that we refer to as the nape of the neck in CQC, where the spinal cord enters the brain, including the cervical vertebrae and cervical spinal cord, must be hard protected under an actions on, as outcomes of contact can be fatal. The nape refers to the back of the head and neck in MIL CQC and the 7 cervical vertebrae bones that make up the spinal column in this region of the neck. Specifically, the nape includes the posterior back part of the cervical spine. The occipital lobe is the smallest and rearmost lobe of the brain, of which there are 4 major lobes that all have specific special functions but operate together to enable all our human required and executed functions and processes to be possible. Actions on armed and unarmed hard impact contact to the occipital lobe, including hard hitting, momentum, or decentralization contact with hard surfaces, edges, or protrusions, can be life-threatening and result in fatal outcomes. As we say in MIL CQC, forget about your wishbone in an actions on, as your head and neck bone matters more under assault. The 4 lobes of the brain are the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Your occipital lobe is the visual processing hub of your brain, and in close combat and self-defense is most important in threat identification, recognition, and all aspects of visual employments of skills by processing visual signals, information, and by cohesive, cooperative functions with other parts of the brain. It also majorly contributes to such roles as memory storage and the recognizing of people, places, colors, and movements, along with other vital functions like the important required functions of combative assessment and ensuring primary threat neutralization decision-making. The cervical spine and spinal cord is made up of 7 cervical vertebrae between its entry point at the back of the head to the brain, running down to the start of the thoracic spinal column. The cervical spinal cord and cervical vertebral column, commonly referred to as the nape of the neck, are part of the full spinal cord and bony vertebral column that also includes the thoracic, lumbar, and cox or tailbone, as it's commonly known. Your spinal cord is like a wiring harness that transmits signals between the brain and the rest of the body. The cervical vertebrae is the bony structure that encapsulates and protects the cervical spinal cord. The cervical column not only supports the head, but is important in head movement. There are cervical discs between each vertebrae that act as shock absorbers and assist with movement. There are also facet joints in the cervical spine, one on each side of the vertebrae, that take care of controlled, stable movement. C1 to C7 injuries where the spinal cord is damaged can be serious or fatal, resulting in paralysis respiration difficulties, or death. Outcomes can depend on the level of momentum impact force and the means of contact, as well as the location of the cervical spinal column and spinal cord injury. Those closer to the brain being considered higher risk of loss of bodily functions like autonomic function, sensation, and heart rate and blood pressure. Severe injuries between C1 and C4 to the spinal cord can result in quadriplegia, as in paralysis of all four extremities. Military close combat methods for the destruction of the spinal cord at the C1 atlas and C2 axis level, where the skull ligaments connect to the first cervical vertebrae, are considered in battlefield actions on as fatal. I remember the questioning of the Fairburn blood clock in regard to time from the severing of the carotid arteries to death by those that did not take into consideration the battlefield, and once a combatant is fatally incapacitated, the realities under an actions on of not being able to get immediate medical life-saving assistance. Under spinal cord severing of the cervical spinal cord, especially at the C1 and C2 atlas and axis on the battlefield, the same applies to bleeding out, in that death would not be immediate, but the result would be immediate paralysis, and without life-saving medical assistance, death within minutes. The back of the brain canister, nape of the neck, cervical spinal cord, and cervical vertebrae at the C1 atlas and C2 axis are extremely vulnerable to serious life-changing injuries and to fatal outcomes. The atlas relates to the first cervical vertebrae, which is ring-shaped to support the skull and provide for direct line forward and backward movement. The axis relates to the second cervical vertebrae, which has a projection peg known as the dens that enables a pivoting point capability that, when combined with the atlas, enables the skull to rotate, providing movement from side to side. In our MIL, CQC and MSD, we protect the back of a head and neck where our spinal cord enters our brain, and our cervical spinal column and cord like our life depends upon it, because it does. Hardcover guarding protection is a must. While the mentally tough combatant can overcome the effects of contact to many parts of the human anatomy and get over and get on with dealing with hostilities and objective achievement, when it comes to occipital bone and lobes, as well as cervical column and spinal cord contact, they simply may well not be able to, and the outcome will be fatal. There are multiple serious injuries that can result in back of head and neck hard contact under assault, including function damage of the nervous system that includes the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. Such damage can affect and interfere with general movement, cognitive function, coordination, sensation, vision, speech, and memory. Weakness, tremors or paralysis, respiration and heart rate function issues are other effects of back of head and nape of neck assault contact, and, of course, death. Effects can be localized or widespread, disrupting or interfering with multiple bodily functions and capabilities, and as such stand to reduce or eliminate combative capabilities. As well as spinal vertebrae and spinal cord and nerve damage in CQC MSD actions on, there can be related muscles and ligaments damage. There are ligaments, muscles, and nerves required for movement, extension, retraction, including lifting, lowering, rotating, and resistance. In overkill MIL close combat, the close to maximum use of destruction, output force, employment of skills meant to destroy life support systems by means of breaking the neck and severing the spinal cord will also damage ligaments, muscles, and nerves, which is not the primary objective but is collateral damage. There are muscles positioned on each side of the neck from behind your ear to the front of your neck that attach to your sternum and collarbones. There are muscles that extend from the base of your skull down your cervical and thoracic spine to your shoulder blades. There is a muscle that attaches the first and fourth cervical vertebrae to the top of the shoulder blades. This concludes part 1 on the head and neck medical implications and considerations. Part 2 will carry on from this point.